week's topic is climate science. Climate is different than weather in that weather is a measure of what's happening in the atmosphere at a given moment. But climate is the overall view of a region's weather conditions over a long period of time. And this is something that's going to be very consistent for thousands of years. There are two major aspects of climate: average temperatures throughout the year and average water conditions, meaning rainfall throughout the year. The two aspects of climate can be represented on a graph like this. You can see that on the bottom we have the months of the year, and then the blue bars represent the average precipitation throughout the year, and the red line shows how the temperature goes up and down throughout the year. Looking at the average yearly precipitation and temperature of a place gives you a sense of its climate. In the one on the left, Daly Waters, Australia, you can see that it's a fairly warm temperature throughout the year, and we have a rainy season and a dry season. In Iquitos, Peru, it is a much more rain throughout the year, and the temperature is very steady throughout. And then lastly, in Yakutsk, Russia, we have very low rainfall and a temperature that fluctuates drastically throughout the year. There are 5 factors that affect climate. Number 1 is latitude. Number 2 is global winds, which are sometimes called planetary winds or prevailing winds. Number 3 is oceans and lakes. Number 4 is mountains, and number 5 is vegetation and soil. As we've already studied, latitude has a big effect on climate. Low latitudes, which are close to the equator, receive more high-intensity insolation, so they are warmer. The second one we've already studied as well, which is global wind patterns, and we know that global winds move air masses in a particular path across the planet. So some latitudes are wet latitudes, and some latitudes are dry. You can see in this picture that we have regions of different color, and that represents how much rainfall those areas get. The dark green regions are the wettest regions of the planet, and the tan or yellowish regions are the driest regions, and that's where most of the world's deserts form. The third factor that affects climate are oceans and lakes, and there's a couple ways that they do that. The first is that land near large bodies of water have less temperature fluctuations, and this is because water has a high specific heat capacity, so it moderates the temperature. You can see here that land that's near the water, like San Francisco, California, has warmer winters and cooler summers. There's not that much of a difference between the warmest and the coldest temperatures throughout the year, whereas Wichita, Kansas has a huge temperature fluctuation between summer and winter, and that's because it's so far away from the ocean. Oceans also affect climate because of the ocean currents. Ocean currents bring warm weather to cool regions and cool weather to warm regions. And you can see on page 4 of your reference table, the surface ocean currents map shows whether warm water or cold water is being brought to an area. Ocean currents have a huge effect on climate. You can see that Europe is at the same latitude as Canada, but it has a much warmer climate because the warm Gulf Stream ocean current effectively transfers heat from the equator to higher latitudes, and this results in a place like Ireland that having palm. The fourth factor that affects climate are mountains. We know that as air rises over a mountain, it increases altitude, which means it becomes cooler, and its humidity capacity also decreases. This means that higher altitudes are going to be colder climates, and also it's going to rain on one side of these mountains. In this diagram, you can see that the windward side, which is the side where the prevailing winds are blowing, becomes the wetter side of the mountain, and the leeward side becomes a rain shadow. It becomes much drier in those places. The last factor that affects climate is vegetation, which is closely related to soil. We'll study soil in more depth in our next topic. Like oceans and lakes, forests have a moderating effect on temperature. Trees absorb lots of solar energy and store it when they convert it into food, so forests make climates cooler by reducing the amount of insolation that reaches the land. This diagram kind of illustrates how forests make climates wetter. You can see that the slope on the left, a lot of that water is going to be absorbed into that forest, whereas the slope on the right, there's nothing really to absorb all that water. Because trees absorb so much water, they also evaporate a lot of water. Now, the special word for when water is evaporated through a tree is called transpiration. So because trees transpire so much water, they have a cooling effect on the climate. This is the same way that an engine is cooled by the radiator. Water is taken from the hot part of the engine and then cooled down. This is the same effect that trees have on a climate. It takes that hot water from the land and evaporates it into the atmosphere, so the land becomes cooler. You can see this effect in what they call the urban heat island effect. The lack of vegetation and evaporation causes cities to remain warmer than the surrounding countryside, where there's a lot more vegetation.